All right. We're ready, right? Got fun? Have a nice relaxing break. That's more relaxing this time. Last time we had snow, I mean, my power didn't go out. I don't know if y'all did, but at least I didn't have to deal with that issue. There was a lot more. I'm gonna get a little bit quickly today. We have a lot to cover. Hopefully we can get done by the end of the class. If we don't, anything that's left over, we'll just carry on to next week. But before I begin, does anyone have any questions and dealing with the syllabus? I saw everyone completed the syllabus quiz, so I appreciate that. Okay. All right. So you look at the requirements for this week, right? Look at the requirements for what? And if you've been in my so let's go ahead and get started. But before we do that, this is why I tell you a little bit, right? What do we mean by race or one's racial background? Right? What does it really mean? And then we'll also be talking about the differences between race and ethnicity, right? Typically, people use these terms interchangeably, but they're different. They're measuring or tapping into different things, and we'll talk about how they're different and how measuring race and ethnicity has vital importance for how we measure crime. We'll also be briefly talking about immigration and how it's really changed the demographic landscape of the United States. So historically speaking, when we talked about race, we typically just talked about whites and blacks. But now when we talk about race and ethnicity, we have to include the Latinos and Hispanics, Asians. We also talk about groups who make up two or more races, right? So immigration itself has really impacted how we think about race and ethnicity in the United States. We'll also talk about, as I mentioned earlier, some of the key issues with measuring race and ethnicity in the United States. So various police departments are going to measure race and ethnicity differently, and that can have implications on the race and crime relationship. And then we'll talk about this issue of race and crime, right? What does it really mean when we say the race and crime relationship? What is that alluding to? What is that getting at? What are the main issues? What are the main questions? So these are some of the key objectives that we'll be talking about today. All right. So when we're talking about this idea of race, historically, before the United States was founded, prior to the 1500s, race was used to describe people from a common ancestry or kinship. So people who might share like a similar lineage, for example, that's how race was historically before the 1500s. Y'all have these notes? You got them? Okay. People based on their skin color or other physical features, or maybe their ancestral homeland, right? Where certain people come from, right? Their ancestors. But race today has real world implications, right? So when we talk about race, and we're talking about social indicators such as crime, employment, housing, right? All these things are highly correlated with race. And let me show you what I mean, right? So if we're looking at poverty or socioeconomic status in the United States, we see that there's great variation across race and ethnicity, right? Latinos and African Americans, as you can see here, have very, very high rates. It's also a social concept, right? So I've given this example. I know some of you have heard it before since you've been in my classes. So one example I like to give as crime as a social construct is this idea that in my pocket, for example, I have this drug that's crack cocaine, right? It's crack cocaine. It's a drug that you smoke. It's highly addictive. And during the height of its use, it killed approximately 15,000 Americans every year. And getting caught with this drug can lead to significant prison time, right? Crack cocaine itself is a drug that's heavily penalized. Now, in this other pocket, I have another drug. It's also a drug you smoke. It's also a drug that's highly addictive. And at the height of its use, it killed approximately 500,000 Americans each year. But if I'm caught with this drug, it's not a crime, right? Or if I sell you this drug, it's not a crime. It's just business. And what I have on this hand is tobacco. Okay? Both drugs are highly addictive, right? Both drugs that you smoke. Though tobacco itself is not a crime, but it's far more harmful in terms of how many deaths it's led to in America over the years. Okay? So it's not really the behavior, it's not the harm caused by the behavior, it's the social meaning that we give to behavior that makes something criminal. Okay? And so race is kind of the same thing. It's how we define groups, how we separate them, is really based on socially accepted definitions. And over time, how we define groups or how many groups we have in our racial categories has changed. Okay? So, like in the 1930s, for example, US Census would recognize 3 racial groups. Right? We had whites, we had blacks, and then we had an other category. Today, we have approximately 6. Right? So over time, our social definitions of various racial categories or various racial groups has changed. Now, going back to this idea of race and biological connections, now, recent DNA advances have challenged this idea that race itself is not linked to biology. Now, with DNA, for example, we can determine the race of an individual, right? So there is maybe a small part of DNA that is attached to biology. We'll talk about this here in a minute. But for the most part, it's still a socially accepted definition. And here's an example I like to give, illustrating how race and biology are not as strongly linked as we would suggest. So here we have 3 males. We have Watson, Venter, and Kim. And I know it might be kind of hard for some of you in the back to see, but Watson and Venter would probably identify as white males, and Kim is an Asian male. Now, based on this Venn diagram here, this Venn diagram represents the biological makeup of these 3 men. And as you can see here, Kim, the Asian male, actually shares more in common with Watson and Venter than Watson and Venter do with one another. So this idea that race and biology are highly linked is not as strong as one would suggest. And in this case, what we can see is that a person of a different race actually shares more in common biologically with 2 white males than the 2 white males do with one another. So this point here, as some scholars who study race and stress, that there's actually more variation within racial categories than there is between them. Let's see. So let's go back to talking about DNA databases in biology. So as I mentioned before, and I'm sure many of you have watched crime shows where in those crime shows you see that with DNA profile, they can identify the race of a suspect. Now, DNA databases have become incredibly helpful for law enforcement and prosecutors to help bring criminals to justice. And so here I'm specifically talking about FBI's CODIS database. And you don't have to know this, but if you're just interested in what CODIS means combined DNA index system, right? That's what it stands for. Combined DNA index system. Okay. Now, in terms of how your criminal profile or your DNA gets into CODIS is going to vary across states, right? Vary across jurisdictions. In some states, there's only certain crimes that qualify. For example, in one state, it'd be all felony arrest or all felony convictions. And meeting that criteria is how your DNA gets entered into CODIS. In other states, it might include some misdemeanor crimes, probably not all, but some misdemeanor crimes, as well as felonies that could allow your DNA to be collected and entered into CODIS. So there's going to be variation across states in terms of how they set the rules of the parameters of how your DNA gets entered into CODIS. And again, what's also become a notable issue recently is that in some states, now they're collecting your DNA, or they're mandating that your DNA be collected even before you're convicted, right? So at the arrest stage, if you're arrested for certain crimes, especially a felony, you can have your DNA collected, right? Even before conviction. So there's a lot of variation, again, across geographies or states, jurisdictions, about how they define the rules of how your DNA gets entered. But the CODIS system itself has been incredibly helpful in solving cases. So I think I have here over 545,000 investigations where CODIS has assisted prosecutors and law enforcement. I think the last time I read this, I was reading a book last night, and it was over 600,000. Right, so this number keeps going up and up, especially given new advances in DNA technology, where now we're able to track a DNA, or you can use a DNA profile to track someone's family history or lineage. And in the CODIS system, as of 2021, there's over 20 million DNA profiles, again, collected across all 50 states. So CODIS itself, DNA collection and DNA technology, what it represents is a technological advancement, right? And every year, every day, we're making technological advancements in the field of law enforcement that are helping police and prosecutors, again, bring suspects to justice. But anytime we have advancements in technology, one thing we have to consider or balance out is a balance between privacy concerns as well as public safety concerns. So typically, these things kind of counterbalance one another, right? Or they go against one another. So you can live in a society where you have more privacy, but having more privacy or even human rights, it might affect your level of public safety. Or on the other hand, right? You want to get rid of some rights, minimize private safety a little bit, then you can increase public safety. So has anyone heard recently what's going on in El Salvador? What's going on in El Salvador? Yeah, I forget the president's name, but he's made a big push to go after MS-13 and other gangs that have been operating in El Salvador. Right? We think of El Salvador, we typically associate it with MS-13, which is not a very good thing. And so what the president has been able to do is really decrease the level of violence that's occurred in El Salvador. Right? El Salvador had the highest rate, or one of the highest rates of homicide across the world. Right? It's a very, very dangerous place. Even the U.S. Wouldn't advise people to travel there. But recently, the president has been able to bring down crime by going after MS-13. Now, he's basically been locking up or going after people who have some form of tattoos, right? That's a big way that they target people is through tattoos, because they associate tattoos with gang membership. Now, what's been going on in the country is that they've been arresting a lot of gang members, but in the process, they've also arrested people who had nothing to do with gangs. They've arrested people that were innocent and they were thrown in prison. without any trials, right? Without any attorney or legal representation. And so they're bringing down crime, right? They're increasing public safety, but at the expense of privacy and human rights, right? So again, just kind of illustrate these things kind of counteract one another. And there always has to be an appropriate balance with privacy and public safety, especially when we're talking about technology. All right. So talking about DNA databases, the American Civil Liberties Union has stressed three concerns with the use of DNA databases in law enforcement. So let me tell you what those three are. The first one is going to be invasion of medical privacy. So the first one is invasion of medical privacy. So invasion of medical privacy. The idea there is that the ACLU is concerned that these DNA databases will eventually find their way to the hands of insurance companies, right? Specifically health insurance companies. And that health insurance companies will use these DNA databases to charge higher premiums to people who might have a genetic profile that makes them susceptible to certain cancers, certain diseases. So that's the concern of invasion of medical privacy, right? It's this concern that health insurance companies will get their hands on these databases and use them to charge higher premiums, higher costs overall to people who might have some genetic risks to certain cancers and disease. The second one is invasion of bodily integrity. Okay. So it's invasion of bodily integrity. And the idea there, what ACLU is stressing, is with invasion of bodily integrity, that when someone comes and collects your DNA, right, they take a cotton swab and they get in your face and they swab the inside of your cheek, that itself is a very, invasion of one's private space. Again, it's not my argument, right? It's ACLU's argument that collecting someone's DNA is very invasive. Now, that might have been true before 2020, but after 2020, after the pandemic, right, most of us, right, if we're getting swabbed for COVID, right, we have to swab ourselves. Either we do it or someone else, someone in the medical field will swab our nose. And that itself is probably maybe very invasive, but we're all used to it. So maybe it's not much of a concern anymore. The third one, the one that's most relevant to our class, is possible racial disparate impacts. So possible racial disparate impacts. So the idea of possible racial disparate impacts. Let's just say hypothetically that in certain places, blacks and Latinos are more likely to be racially profiled, more likely to be targeted by the police, and thus have higher rates of arrest. Right? Well, let's just say hypothetically that happens in a particular place. If it's racial profiling or targeting of specific groups, blacks and Hispanics are more likely to get arrested. Right? Say that's true, hypothetically. If that's the case, then what you'll see in these forensic databases, especially those used by CODIS or by law enforcement, is you're going to have an overrepresentation of blacks and Hispanics in these DNA database systems. That's what possible racial disparate impacts refers to. Okay, so talking about how law enforcement can use DNA databases when they can collect a DNA sample? That's been a question that's been raised or was raised in this Maryland versus King Supreme Court case. Okay? So I want to play a video highlighting that issue and talking about this case. And then we'll talk about the importance or when we believe police should be allowed to collect someone's DNA evidence.
Now Texas is getting the TurboTax app.
Free. Salisbury, Maryland, April 10th, 2009. Police arrest Alonzo King Jr. for waving a gun at a group of people. They later find a 12-gauge shotgun in his car and charge him with assault. So you see, in Maryland, there's this law called the DNA Collection Act. It gives the police the authority to collect DNA samples and put them in a database prior to convicting the person. So back at the station, police get a sample of King's DNA by swabbing the inside of his cheek, sending it to be analyzed and uploaded to the database. On August 4th, the results came back, showing King's DNA matched the DNA in an unsolved rape case from 2003. A grand jury said, "Dude, we are indicting you for that." So King went on trial for the rape case. King was like, "What? What does that have to do with the reason why I got arrested in the first place?" He filed a motion to block the DNA evidence from being used in court for Wicomico County, saying his Fourth Amendment rights were broken because the DNA swab fell under unreasonable searches and seizures. The judge denied his motion, and King pleaded not guilty to the rape charge. The DNA sample was the only real evidence linking King to the rape. The trial court found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. However, King appealed to the Maryland Court of Appeals, who reversed the conviction, saying the DNA sampling went against the Fourth Amendment, as King argued. They argued King's right to privacy was more important than Maryland's desire to use his DNA to identify him. And yet, they still said the DNA Collection Act was constitutional. Maryland appealed the ruling, asking the Supreme Court to look at the case, and they did on February 26, 2013. The main issue with this case was whether or not the Fourth Amendment allowed states to sample and analyze DNA from folks arrested but not convicted of serious crimes. The court announced their decision on June 3rd. They sided with Maryland. It was 5-4, but it wasn't your typical liberal-leaning versus conservative-leaning decision. I mean, you had Antonin Scalia on the same team as Alina Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for crying out loud. Justice Anthony Kennedy gave the opinion, arguing the DNA swab test did not violate the Fourth Amendment because it served the safety of the state of Maryland, yet wasn't too invasive where a warrant would be needed. The court also argued that the DNA records were basically just an extension of other ways the police already kept databases of people they arrested to help solve future crimes, comparing it to things like fingerprinting. Justice Scalia wrote a passionate dissent, arguing the Fourth Amendment definitely prohibits the police from searching a person for evidence of a crime if it's a completely different crime than the one the person was arrested for. Scalia argued, sure, the DNA of arrested people helps the police solve more crimes, but they could also solve more crimes if they collected DNA anytime someone enrolled in public school or got a driver's license, which was an absurd thing to consider. Maryland v. King is a recent decision that has big implications on those living in one of the 30 states where they can arrest you, force you to give a DNA sample, and then later charge you with a different crime based on the results of the DNA sample. Although not many Americans know about the case, it's yet another example of how many argue the Fourth Amendment is consistently threatened as technology gets more and more advanced.
All right. So the main question here is whether or not collecting one's DNA should be part of the standard booking procedure. Right? Most people, when they get arrested, from what I've heard, I don't know by experience, but from what I've heard, right, they take your picture, they collect your fingerprints, for example, they verify your name, and so forth. So do we believe during that standard booking procedure, during that process, should your DNA also be collected? Yes, no? Does it matter for which crime they're arrested for? Should it only occur after conviction, or can it occur during the arrest stage? What do y'all think? That was his reasoning for going against Maryland in this Maryland versus King case. Yes. A research project where I was studying the use of drones among law enforcement agencies in the state of Texas. And so I was reading the literature. There's really not much because drones is a relatively new technology. And what a lot of people were arguing against using drones in policing is, again, this use of maybe drones as surveillance without warrants, right? These constitutional issues of Fourth Amendment rights that would be violated, right? This is something I was reading, and people, it's easy, right? Anytime, again, there's technological advancements, it's that question that's going to come up. And so I'm here reading it, and then later on I start talking to police officers who are on their drone teams, and I'm asking them, it's like, hey, do you ever get issues with people like in the public arguing or saying that, hey, your drone is flying over my backyard and it's an invasion of my privacy, or you're doing a warrantless surveillance, whatnot. And so I talked to them, and they were like, no, that stuff doesn't really come up, mainly because we only deploy drones when we're going after bad guys, for example. And most people, right, if there's a bad guy running through your neighborhood, you want the bad guy to get caught, right? So you don't care if they're using drones or not to surveil the area, right? You want that bad guy to get caught. And so sometimes what we think about or what we might argue in the literature might not align with really what goes on in reality. But something that's kind of related to this. Back to presentation mode. It's racial groups that we'll be talking about throughout the course of the semester. For the first racial category, we have whites. And whites, specifically whites of certain ethnicities, have experienced discrimination in the U.S., right? Notably those of German or Irish origin, later on Italians. Those ethnic white groups have all experienced discrimination in the U.S. And so it's kind of hard to read here, but this cartoon, what it's depicting is an Irish or a violent Irish American. Right? So there was this argument among people in Ireland that once you went to the United States, you became this very violent criminal. And so acts of public drunkenness, acts of violence were highly associated with Irish Americans, especially in the early 1900s. Now, in the early 1900s, we had a lot of ethnic whites immigrating to the United States, mainly from places such as Italy, Poland, Russia. People that were different from our traditional white groups from Germany and England. So in 1921 and 1924, we implemented what was known as the Immigration Acts or Quota Acts. And what this eventually did was really shut down immigration in the U.S. So you look at immigration to the U.S. over time, and you'll see in the 1920s, 1930s, there was very, very low rates of immigration. And it was predominantly due to these quota acts. Now, despite this discrimination that many foreign-born people from Ireland and Italy experienced when they first arrived in the United States, their children and grandchildren, or what we call the second and third generation, eventually assimilated into the broader white population, and they didn't experience the same stigma and discrimination as their ancestors did. This is a quote here from 1753. He asks this question: why should the Palatine Moors, which is German, be suffered to swarm into our settlements, and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion. So this quote, what Benjamin Franklin is arguing, is against the threats that he perceives from Germans immigrating to the United States, specifically immigrating to Pennsylvania in the mid 1700s. So really what he's talking about here, right, is the threat, the cultural threat that Germans will bring when they start settling in large numbers in the United States. And to some extent, one could argue that Benjamin Franklin was right, to the extent that in the United States today, the most common ethnic ancestry is German, not English. Okay? So he did kind of have a point, right? He did understand what was going on here. Next group, African Americans or Black Americans. So overall, in the criminal justice system and in the U.S. society, with probably the exception of Native Americans, no group has experienced more discrimination than African Americans. Right? Yes, it's Latinos, right, have experienced discrimination. Asians have experienced discrimination. Certain ethnic white groups have experienced discrimination, but not to the same extent as African Americans. And traditionally, when we're talking about race and crime, as I argued earlier, most of the comparisons in terms of race and crime was made between black and white offenders. So traditionally, when we think about race and crime, we think about blacks as white only and ignore other groups, which is the main issue or big issue that we'll be talking about. African Americans today and historically have experienced the most segregation in the U.S. Right? So we're talking about racial and housing segregation. African Americans, even to this day, remain the most segregated group in the U.S. And we'll talk about next week, or in a couple of weeks, how that has implications for crime. Next one. Native American groups. So typically, when we think about Native Americans, we think about them as one group. But in reality, they're a very diverse group. They're diverse in terms of where they live, right, where they settled, their culture, their traditions, the language that they speak, how many members they still have in their tribal system or tribal group. And even the communities that they live in today are very, very different and diverse. But there's something unique about Native Americans that's different than all other groups, right? So there's some experience that they have that's related to tribal sovereignty, right? So the majority of Native Americans live on Native American reservations or reservation lands, and those regions are thought of as autonomous regions. And so Native Americans, right, typically have their own tribal courts, their own tribal police system, that other groups don't experience. Right? So very, very different. We're talking about criminal justice through the lens of Native Americans. But Native Americans are woefully understudied, right? There's really not a lot of studies out there on Native Americans, right? Part of this is because relatively they're a small group compared to other racial and ethnic groups. And it can be pretty hard to gain access to reservation lands and do research there. But yet, what we do know from the literature is that Native Americans have some of the highest rates of both crime and poverty. Right? So there's a small group, but have really high rates of crime and poverty, and more research is needed on this group specifically. So we have Asian Americans. So we're talking about Asian Americans, right? Again, it's a very broad and heterogeneous group. And in the U.S., the most popular or populous Asian groups are going to be those from China and those from India. We also have substantial numbers of Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans, and other Asian groups. But in terms of overall numbers, those from China and India are the most populous groups. As I mentioned earlier, Asians too have experienced widespread discrimination in the United States. The earliest forms of discrimination probably go down to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which basically banished and outlawed all Chinese laborers during the late 1800s and early 1900s. So this Chinese Exclusion Act was probably a precursor to Quota Acts I mentioned previously. And it was one of these immigration acts to show that certain groups, in this case Chinese and even Japanese Americans, were not wanted, or not Chinese and Japanese immigrants. Today, in the United States, most immigrants entering the U.S. are of Asian descent, not Latino, Asian descent. Now that's kind of shifted maybe recently, but over the last 10, 15 years, most of those immigrants entering the U.S. are of Asian descent. And kind of getting to their widespread discrimination and experiences, we know that during 2020, with the rise of COVID, that Asian Americans bear the brunt of discrimination related to COVID and the pandemic. Okay, so now let's differentiate between race and ethnicity. So race and ethnicity are going to have some overlap with one another in terms of how they're defined. But typically when we think about ethnicity, we're thinking about people who share some common culture or language. They can also come from a specific ancestral homeland or region of the world. But typically we specify or categorize ethnicities based on the common language and culture or ancestral homeland. Whereas with race, again, we're defining it based on physical features, mainly one's skin color. So your ethnicity is a little bit different. And in the US, when we're talking about ethnicity, the group we're often talking about is going to be Hispanic and Latinos. Now, those two terms, Hispanic and Latinos, are also a little bit different, right? People use them interchangeably, but Hispanic refers to people from Spain or Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, whereas Latino refers to people born in Latin American countries only, not necessarily that they speak Spanish. But another example of ethnicity is Arab. So typically we think of Arab as people being of Muslim faith or Islamic faith, and that's partly true. But typically, with the real definition of Arab, is people who speak the Arab language. And in the Middle East, in a lot of Arab countries, there is a sizable number of people, not a large number, but a sizable number of people who are Arab and also Christian. So there's some overlap with Arab and religion, but it's not 100%. Now, why is it important to account for ethnicity? The importance is here, right? It's possible that people share a common culture or heritage, right? They might make up the same ethnicity, but possibly a different race, right? In Latin American countries, maybe like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, you might have everyone who lives there identify as Hispanic or Latino for their ethnicity, but maybe certain people might identify differently in terms of their race, right? Maybe someone would be regarded as a white race but Hispanic ethnicity, or a black race and Hispanic ethnicity. But in the U.S., in criminal justice statistics, the importance of ethnicity is that we use it to account for the Hispanic population. And again, it's critical to differentiate between race and ethnicity because Hispanics and Latinos today are the largest minority group in the U.S. But historically speaking, in most criminal justice agencies, they have not included a separate indicator or measurement for ethnicity. Right? So many jurisdictions historically have measured race, but not ethnicity. So it's unclear how Hispanic rates of offending might differ from those of Black, Asians, or whites. And the growth of the Hispanic and Latino population itself has been predominantly driven by immigration. Right? Typically, we think of those two things as highly collinear or overlapping with one another. And that's partly true. Since 1965, we've seen a large growth in the Hispanic population. Right? In 1965, we had less than 10 million foreign-born people living in the U.S. And most recently, or in 2020 or 2018, we now have about 43, 44 million immigrants living in the U.S. It's a sizable shift in growth in the immigrant population. And the majority of these immigrants were of Latino descent, some were of Asian, but the majority were of Latino descent. So immigration in itself has changed our demographic landscape. Right? As I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about race and crime, it was just principally focusing on blacks and whites. But now, due to immigration, we have to account for Hispanics and Asians and even black immigrants' rates of offending. So immigration itself has changed how we think about race, how we think about ethnicity, and how we account for these various groups in criminal justice statistics. Immigration, we're talking about the U.S.-Mexico border, we're talking about migrants who are coming over from mainly Latin America, maybe other places like Haiti. And so we predominantly think about immigrants as being poor. And that's true to some extent, but there's also a sizable number of immigrants who enter the U.S. with an abundant number of what we call human capital resources. Right? Many immigrants also enter the country having high rates of education, having work training skills for professional jobs, like such as jobs in healthcare, jobs in the engineering sector, oil and gas, things like that. So when we have a majority, a large proportion of immigrants who enter being of marginal status or poor, there's also a sizable number who come in or enter being fairly well off. And today, a majority of immigrants come from Asia and Latin America. Over time, most of them have come from Latin America, but we're talking about more recently, more immigrants of Asian descent. What's also changed is more immigrants are living. So as you look at this map here, this is looking at percentage change in the foreign-born population across the U.S. And the dark figures or the dark squares here represent greater growth in the immigrant population. And as you see here, right, we have a large percentage of immigrants here in the Houston, Dallas area, also in Southern California. This part of Illinois here, Chicago, saw a sizable number in South Florida. But there's also other places like North Carolina, North Georgia, comes out in Iowa, where immigrants. So coming to the U.S., there are various ways you can legally immigrate to the U.S. But the two main ones are by being sponsored by a family member, right? We call it family reunification, right? Maybe as a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, you're sponsoring your wife or maybe your mother and father who live abroad come live with you in the U.S. So that's one type, is family reunification. The second one is skilled immigrants. So the U.S. immigration system prioritizes people from abroad who have college degrees and who are coming to the U.S. to fill some job of need, right? Jobs where we have high demand, where we don't have enough employees or workers here in the U.S. to fill them. We look outside of the U.S., right? Mainly for skilled immigrants to fill those jobs. So those are the two main ways you can legally immigrate to the U.S. Right? There's other ways, for example, asylum, yes, and there's additional ways to that. But the two main ones for legal immigration is family reunification and skilled immigration. Another thing that led to increased immigration was tougher border enforcement during the 1990s. So, historically speaking, immigrants have come to the U.S., right, for long periods of time, right? So, in my case, for example, my grandmother was born in Minnesota, and I remember asking my grandma, like, "Grandma, how the hell were you born in Minnesota?" Right? We have no family out there. But historically speaking, her parents were temporary migrants, right? They came to the U.S. to work the fields, and during one of those trips of employment, they had my grandmother in Minnesota. But immigration from these regions was always temporary, right? They would come and work the fields, and then they would go back to Mexico, wherever they came from, when the job was finished. But in the 1990s, we kind of changed those rules and really protected and militarized the U.S.-Mexico border. And so because of that, a lot of migrants from these places had to make a decision. Am I going to stay in my homeland permanently, or am I going to stay in the U.S. permanently? Just because it was so hard and treacherous to cross the U.S.-Mexico border after the 1990s. Right? So a lot of people lost their lives, right, crossing the U.S.-Mexico border after the 1990s, paid large amounts of money to cross, and so because of that, they would stay permanently in the U.S. versus return to their homeland. So I have a figure here, 2018, 45 million immigrants in the U.S. That's probably gone up since that time. Now, questions always asked, what percent are undocumented? What percent of this 45 million are undocumented? And the answer to that, it's hard to give a real answer because we don't know, right? We can guess, we can estimate, but the answer we typically give is about 23%, right? A little bit less than a quarter. So that translates to about 11 million undocumented immigrants. So those 45 million, 11 million, we guess, are undocumented. Now this bottom part, it says, where do most undocumented immigrants come from? Most of them are coming from Central America and Asia, right? Most of them used to come from Mexico, but we're actually seeing a decline of undocumented immigrants from Mexico. Most of them are coming from other Central American countries and Latin America, as well as Asia. Go ahead and stop here. Go ahead and slide these lecture. Okay, so we left off talking about how race, the idea of race, how we separate people mainly by their skin color, by their ancestral homeland, how that's based on socially accepted definitions of how we should group people. And by emphasizing that, and I know in your PAC discussions, a lot of people said, yes, it's a social construct, right? This idea of race is socially constructed. But even though it's socially constructed, doesn't have really any biological basis or meaning, it still has a lot of real world implications. The reason why we're studying race today, even though it's a social construct, is because race matters, right? Our starting points in life, right? Where we live, the type of communities we live, our exposure to violence or lack thereof, our education level, the educational attainment. A lot of that is really defined by race, right? So even though we might think of race as this idea that's socially made up, it still has life impact. Well, last week, one thing I was hinting at or discussing when you get to it is that really how we measure race and ethnicity in criminal justice data is pretty problematic. Right? There's a lot of issues with it, and that's what this slide specifically goes over. It's problems with criminal justice data in regards to race and ethnicity. So, with the one point, the argument here is that for racial identification or ethnic identification in crime statistics, sometimes that's self-reported, right? So sometimes either the victim of a crime or the offender that's arrested gets to report what race or ethnicity they are. And sometimes it isn't. And other times, maybe it's a police officer, right? Maybe it's some jail official who looks at this person and says, oh, this person is white. Well, this person's Asian. This person's Native American. Which is problematic because who am I to say what race or ethnicity you are? And has anyone ever done any research or know anything about eyewitness identification? Is it accurate? It's hard, right? There's mistakes, right? People make mistakes. And those mistakes are more common when you're trying to identify a suspect of a different race than you, right? So you can see how that can be problematic, how someone of a different race is trying to identify this person's race and ethnicity, and they can probably get it wrong or how they report it. So that's one problem, is that across jurisdictions, sometimes race is going to be self-reported, either by the offender or the victim of crime, and sometimes it isn't. It's going to be done by a police officer or some other criminal justice official. So you got to keep that in mind. Next one. Individuals can change their racial identity. So, hypothetically speaking, right, if someone's asking me about my race, not my ethnicity, but someone's asking me about my race, I'm going to identify as white, right? That's normally what I've always put down on a survey, for example, that my race itself is white. But say tomorrow I take a DNA test, and the DNA tells me, hey, you're primarily of Native American heritage. Look at my skin color, it's probably plausible. I believe that. And so, hey, next time I take a survey, instead of identifying as white, I'm going to identify as Native American. There's nothing wrong with that because it changed their racial identity. There's no laws against that. You need a law, or you got to go through a legal process to change your name, yes, but that's your racial identity. You can identify however way you want to. And also, historically speaking, because we haven't had separate identifications for ethnicity, most people who are Hispanic and white as a race are included in the white category. So essentially what this point is getting at is that we haven't had, until fairly recently, a separate indicator for ethnicity to measure Hispanics' involvement in crime. So traditionally speaking, Hispanics, or most Hispanics, have been grouped in the white category. And then the main point here is that data on race itself, how it's collected, whether it's self-report or not self-report, varies across jurisdictions. And different jurisdictions are going to have different response choices for one's race and ethnicity. Okay? So let me show you an example of that. So this is a hypothetical example. It's about a woman named Juanita Turner Garcia. And it says here, she's a biracial child who has just been arrested and detained for questioning. Her father is Puerto Rican and her mother is African American. How should the justice system categorize Juanita's race and ethnicity? The answer to that question depends on Juanita's state of residence. So, as an example, in Arizona, Juanita would be able to define her own race and ethnicity, meaning she would be able to self-report. Or in California, she'd be assigned to the category of African American or Black, so essentially going by her mother's ancestry. In Michigan, she would be classified as Hispanic, as well as being assigned a specific racial group. And in Ohio, she would simply just be listed as biracial. So these various response categories differ across jurisdictions, right? So how you're defined in criminal justice statistics in regards to your race and ethnicity matters in terms of where you live, okay? So overall, what this is getting at is that it's really hard to make race and crime comparisons, especially across jurisdictions. So we got to keep that in mind anytime we look at crime statistics and we see them broken down by race and ethnicity. Understand that there's variation in measurement. Right. So, moving on, one of the main purposes of this class is to look at whether or not your race and ethnicity matters in the criminal justice system, right? And so for well over 100 years in criminal justice research, we've been asking this question of whether or not the criminal justice system is biased. But in asking that question, right, we're just looking at the criminal justice system, right? So we're looking at what happens after you are arrested. Understand that when we're talking about a criminal justice system, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of stages, right? After arrest, you're often arraigned, and it's up to a prosecutor to decide whether or not you're going to be charged for the specific crime you're arrested for. And then you start moving down the line, right? Whether you get convicted in courts, you get sentenced to prison, for example, then you have re-entry systems, things like supervision, right? There's a lot of moving parts and stages to the criminal justice system. And so it's really hard to identify whether or not any biases are occurring at any of these stages. Statistically speaking, it's hard to track, difficult to account for. But when we're talking about a race and crime relationship and whether or not there is any biases in the system, here's one example we can look at. Right? We can look at these racial disparities in incarceration rates. I think this is just for state and federal prisons, excluding jails. And as we can see here, there's variation in incarceration rates across race and ethnicity. Right? As you can see, we have Blacks with the highest rate of incarceration, followed by Native Americans, Hispanics, whites, and then Asians with the lowest. So we know that there's variation in incarceration rates. And we can apply this to other types of criminal justice outcomes. We could look at arrest, for example, and see similar variation. So one thing to point out here is that just because we see variation in incarceration rates does not mean that criminal justice biases exist. Okay? Even though there's unequal incarceration or likelihood of imprisonment across race and ethnicity, that does not automatically translate to criminal justice bias. And here's why. The question we want to ask, or want the answers to, is why do those variations exist? And typically there's three answers that are given, right? Whether or not the criminal justice system is biased, or why is there differences in incarceration or arrest across race. There's three types of explanations. The first one is disproportionate involvement in crime. What this answer is alluding to is that the reason why there's variation in incarceration rates is because there's differences in criminal involvement across race and ethnicity. Essentially, what this answer is getting at is that minorities have higher rates of incarceration, especially Blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans, because they commit more crimes. Okay? So it's plausible why we see variation in incarceration rates is because minorities commit more crimes. And this is a stance that Heather McDonald, she's a lawyer for a journal called the City Journal. I think it's in Manhattan. And that's her idea, her belief in why we see variation in incarceration rates. There's no criminal justice biases. That is simply due because minorities commit more crime. And that's why we see disproportionate involvement in the criminal justice system across race and ethnicity. Now, Mark Maurer, who's the director of the Sentencing Project, he does a lot of research on criminal justice issues, especially imprisonment. He agrees with Heather and says, yes, you're right, that minorities do commit more crimes. But even though minorities commit more crimes, that doesn't account for all the reasons why there's variation in incarceration across race and ethnicity. He argues that there's also disparities in criminal justice processing. What that means, essentially, what he's saying is that, yes, minorities do encounter some biases in the criminal justice system. Whether minorities are more likely to be targeted by police officers, whether or not they're more likely to be charged for more serious crimes by prosecutors relative to whites, or whether or not they're more likely to be handed tougher sentences when they're convicted, and more likely to be sent to prison, right? Whatever the reasoning, he's saying that there's both. Both are true. And that's probably the answer to this question, is that yes, for sure there's differential involvement in crime, but there is some criminal justice biases that do exist. And if you want to divide this up and put some math behind it, most scholars would agree that probably 80% of differences in incarceration across race and ethnicity is due to this disproportionate involvement in crime. Meaning 80% of the differences in variation across race is because minorities commit more crime. And essentially that leaves 20% of variation in incarceration due to some form of bias. And again, we don't know where exactly those biases exist, right? This is a very complicated system. So it's really hard to tell where these biases are coming from exactly. And in answering this question, probably the best answer I've ever seen written on this question of whether or not there's biases in the criminal justice system come from a 1997 article by Rob Sampson and Janet Larson, where they say some discrimination some of the times in some places, right? They're saying essentially that yes, there's minorities are more likely to commit crime, but there is some discrimination some of the time and in some places that occur. Okay. You don't have to write this down, but these are some of the questions that we're going to be looking at over the course of this semester, right? So when we talk about race and crime, how has that been studied in research, right? So one is to look at whether or not there are differences in criminal involvement between whites, blacks, Asians, Hispanics, and so forth. And if there are differences in crime or criminal involvement across race, what's the reasons for that, right? What are some logical explanations for why we observe differences in crime across race? And then we're looking at racial and ethnic attitudes towards the police, right? We know fairly recently in 2020 with the death of George Floyd that, that year or that summer, there was this really large protest movement against the police. And what emerged is the historical trauma and relationships that Black individuals and people of other colors have had with police officers. Also, we'll be looking at police officer shootings and whether or not Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be involved in those situations. We'll look at prosecutorial decisions and judicial decisions regarding bail and convictions, and then talking a little bit about the war on drugs and how that's influenced the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. Right? So those are just some of the issues that we'll be tackling this semester. And then the last one, talking about death penalty and whether or not minorities are more likely to receive capital punishment, even when you account for other factors like the seriousness of the crime, prior criminal history, things like that.